Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now, as the title suggests, this episode is all about making homemade Sculptamold. Now, there is a ton of videos out there that cover various different methods of making your own Sculptamold, and I won't deny that I have been inspired by some of these other videos and use the methods and techniques in order to perfect quite a good compound. So this is a continuation of the previous episode where we were looking at the revamped Hillside and the beginning of the polystyrene structure, and also we revisited the water reservoir up on top of the hill and completely rebuilt that using some epoxy resin and a realigned water channel. So in this episode, it's a continuation of the hill formation, and I did leap ahead and started carving some of the hillside into its correct shape and form. So we sort of step in midway and then take a look at the Sculptamold compound and start applying that to the hillside. So I think without further ado, let's just get into what I got up to. So I've moved ahead a little bit from the last series of videos, and we now have all the landform carved into the various shapes surrounding the farmyard down to the wee cottage and meeting up with this bit of rock face here. So there's various little bits of carved features that I've added into this hillside, and that includes a farm access road that sort of runs around the edge of the hill and down into the barn area. And I've also added in a pathway that leads up to the homestead as well, which is also carved in, and then I've added in some strips of card which will form, of course, the basis for a stone wall that will follow the path up to the homestead. I've also carved in where some steps are going to lead up from the road to the wee farmer's cottage, and then I've also worked on the other side of the street where I did put up a wee Facebook post about the Ramshackle Workshop that Metcalfe recently released and converting that to low relief. So that particular area was unusual in the sense that the road rises up slightly, so the actual workshops are stepped to align with that slight rise in the road. So the workshop itself literally is the kit cut in half. So as I assembled the kit, I cut the main building in half as I went to assemble it. And although I didn't actually video that process, you can probably get a reasonably good idea of how the process worked. And quite conveniently, and I'm not sure whether Metcalfe intended this in terms of its versatility, is the wee small attached side to the building which has steps leading up to it actually fitted quite nicely on the back, what would have been the back of the building. So up on the top of the hill, I've laid just a few extra pieces of thick corrugated card where that is just going to increase the landform a little bit, because it was a bit flat and plateaued on top of there, possibly not really looking overly realistic. And of course, as part of this video, that is all going to have the Sculptamold added to create that form. So the card is just basically the base structure for that particular area. So one of the other areas that I've begun working on is on the other side of the road that leads up past the rock cliff face, and creating some extra foam to build up to the level that the goods yard is at, and also the idea of the hill form actually spilling out a little bit further into that plateaued goods yard area, and the idea of it actually sort of coming in and surrounding the actual cattle dock. So some extra bits of foam were added there, and then as with the main hill structure, it was a case of carving that shape and that form down to meet the road, where I also just added in some 3mm MDF to create the retaining wall, which would be part of the road as well, and then sort of plateauing it off and running it down and leveling it down where it sits around the cattle dock. So of course the next step now is to work with this DIY homemade Sculptamold and start to smooth off some of the areas. Now before I do that, of course, I'm actually just going to give the whole hillside a bit of a quick sand, probably not so much where we've got the white standard polystyrene, because I don't think that's going to sand terribly well, but the high density foam sands really nicely, and of course that's going to give the Sculptamold something to actually grip into as that's applied. So I'm not going to actually run Sculptamold over the entire hill section, it's just simply where the joins are between the different layers of polystyrene, and also around areas where, of course, like the path leading up to the homestead, and of course around the rock face as well, and any other cracks and joins. And probably the most intensive area of the Sculptamold, of course, will be right up on top of the hill, where we're going to work it over the layers of cardboard that I've added up there. So looking at this homemade Sculptamold, and there is a mountain of videos out there on DIY homemade Sculptamold, but there's one chap in particular whose video I actually found extremely helpful, and the channel is TheCreativeModellerHO, and the chap's name is Gerben. So I'll leave a link in the description for his particular video, but he went through a process of using 5 different materials in order to create a Sculptamold compound, and of course he evaluated each one, and the one that sort of came out on top was using egg carton material. So anything that your eggs came in, or even if you are a great coffee lover, of course we have got these card trays and of course your egg cartons, and basically it's simply a process that he used of tearing these up into sort of slightly smaller pieces and popping them in a blender. Now, the great thing about this is, unlike the most common method, which seems to be toilet paper, this doesn't need any water to be able to mulch this card up into a nice fluffy type powder. And I guess the only caveat there is to use a reasonably good blender. So if you can pick up second hand a reasonably high quality blender, that's the way to go. I did actually go to Kmart initially and bought a $20 blender, and because you're not using any water, I think that just the sheer amount of heat that's generated, it basically just melted the mechanism. So a good quality blender, you don't need to use any water, and you end up with this really quite nice sort of fluffy material. And I think that's really the sort of consistency that you want for this sort of fiber material. So I actually blended this lot up quite some time ago, and I finally get a chance to use it. The other component, of course, is some plaster of Paris. Now, it's my understanding, after sort of rummaging through tons and tons of videos on this particular subject, that it seems to be a 50-50 mix, not by weight but by volume. So the equivalent volume of this fibrous material against the plaster of Paris, and then, as the usual technique, blend that together, and then of course add water until you get this cottage cheese texture. Now, one of the other things that I did actually neglect to mention that's going to be part of this hillside is also putting in a little bit of rock formation. Now, I picked these up from the local model store, and this is a Knock product, and it is pre-made rock formations which come in a foam type material, so not unlike the high density foam, and Knock make a lot of products out of this type of material. The reason I've gone down this route is I really just couldn't be bothered having to cast rock formations with plaster of Paris. This way I can set these in, they're ready to go, and simply just cut them up to suit how I want them to work. So I think the main reason really I sort of felt that I needed to put some form of rock formation is because we've got that rocky cliff face by the road, which implies really that the terrain in this area is quite rocky. So it would seem odd if there weren't sort of rock formations protruding in various places. So that's what we're actually going to use there. So we'll attach some of these rock formations to the hillside in various locations and start applying some of the Sculptamold. Right, so I've fixed the rocks into place on the hill, and you would have seen there that I used a hot glue gun basically to fix them in place. I think it's just the quickest way. It doesn't need to be perfect because of course the Sculptamold is going to sort of wrap around certain edges and blend it all into the actual hillside landscape. So we'll start by making up this, and I thought we could do a cup of each and see how we go for quantity. So 1 cup of plaster. This may be too much, I don't know, we'll see how we go. And then we'll pop in a cup of this. So I think the idea is that it's by volume, but I think with this stuff here we do actually sort of press it down reasonably, so we've got a compact amount of fibre that's going into here. Now I may, depending on how well this mixes, I may just tip all of this back into the blender to well and truly mix it together, because I think I did spot a video where they actually found that the Sculptamold was improved if the plaster and this pulp fibre was blended in the blender rather than just sort of hand mixed or shaken. But we'll see how we go. So we've packed in a reasonable amount of this pulp fibre, and that will probably do. So we'll tip this into here, and pop a lid on it, and basically give it a good shake. So that's what it's looking like. It seems to be okay. I think it's sort of reasonably well mixed, but I think for extra measure I'm going to give it a little bit more shake. Right, I think that should be enough, hopefully. Now I think what I'm going to do, rather than try and mix all of that up, because there's actually quite a bit there now, is we're just going to tip a bit into another container. Because I think I'll start small and just see how this is actually going to work before I go and do the entire hillside with this material. So we have a wooden spatula here, and we're just going to add water, small amounts at a time, and as is mentioned in many a video, it is getting it to a consistency of cottage cheese. Now I think that might be a little bit too runny in there, so we can just add a little bit more of our compound. Thankfully I quite like cottage cheese, so I have a reasonably good idea of what cottage cheese consistency is like. It's getting pretty close. Now I guess the thing is, you can't dwell on mixing this for too long, because of course the plaster is going to start to go off, so you really sort of got to, I think, move reasonably quickly in order to just a tad more. So that's what we're looking at in terms of consistency. It's probably quite close to a cottage cheese type consistency, so I think we'll go ahead and apply this to a particular area of the hillside and see how it goes. So my understanding is that you apply this and then wait for a few minutes, and then you can just go over it by wetting your fingers and then smooth it to various shapes. Whoops, didn't want to do that. So we've now got to a stage where all the sculpture mold has been applied, and it's almost coming up 24 hours since the initial application, and it does seem to take a wee while to dry. There's still some dark areas in here which tend to sort of indicate there's still a bit of moisture in the sculptor mold, but of course some areas have definitely dried off because it's gone quite a white colour. So once this is fully dry, there might be some areas that I might just sand a little bit. And one of the interesting things that, as I mentioned earlier, was maybe the mixture of the plaster and the fibre compound is actually popped back through the blender, and that might get an even smoother finish, because in some areas of course there is a little bit of lumpiness, which of course would be possibly some clumps of the pulp type fibre. So I've gone around some specific areas, for example where this pathway leads up to the homestead and filled in around those areas where I'd inserted a bit of card, and then also filled in, of course, on the back side of these rock formations, just to give the indication that the landform was spilt down, but you've got some rock work that's exposed from potential erosion and things like that over thousands of years, I guess. So I'll leave it at this point, and then of course the next stage would be to go over all of this with a base coat of paint, and then of course there will be static grass, scatter, all sorts of things like that, and then start sort of planning out to also how the farmyard area is going to work. There will obviously be sort of fences and borders and things like that that need to be added in, but I sort of need to map out where that type of stuff is going to go. So there we have it so far with the hill, and it's certainly starting to take shape and look a little bit more like a hill. And I'm particularly happy with the protruding rock formations. They seem to have worked out quite well, and then I sort of think once it's all covered in a base brown paint and we've got scatters and static grass applied over the top, and then there will be hedges and scrub bushes, brambles, you name it, there'll be all sorts on top of this hill, and I think it's actually hopefully going to come together quite well. So I will leave this hillside for a good week, I think, just to make sure that that Sculptamold really hardens off and dries out before I continue on with it. But in the meantime, I can head back to the boiler workshop and coal merchant's yard, because we now have some goodies that arrived a couple of weeks ago, and I can now start putting some interior detail into the boiler's workshop area. So one of the things I was waiting on, of course, was a arc welder's effect, and this I bought from Heathcote Electronics, and it's a wee circuit device in order to get that arc welder's effect. So one of those is going to be added into that area, and then I kind of went mad and bought a whole lot of stuff from West Hill Wagon Works. So they seem to be the go-to place for 3D printed components, ideal for industrial situations and any kind of workshop. So we have got a trolley with either a pump or a generator on it. We've got some anvils, we've got workshop benches, we've got tool trays, we've got some workshop shelving and storage containers. There's acetylene trolleys, and we've got a drill bench, and we've also got a workshop lathe and bench saw. So of course I haven't got into these yet, so of course they are going to be all painted up. Of course we need to disconnect quite a lot of sprue work that's in some of these components, and then start putting this together and assembling it inside the boiler's workshop. So that may well be the next video that comes up on the channel. So I'll leave it there for today's episode, and I certainly hope you've enjoyed today's episode and gathered some inspiration and ideas for your own layouts. So do take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.